Well, we've heard 5 different views of Andy, different perspectives, and I'd like to share my own perspective. Mine is a little bit different. I've known Andy for a long time. I've actually known Andy for 44 years, and to put that into context, Paul Coan told me last night that he used to look up to me. So that's how long it's been when I first got to know Andy. And I'm going to say something that might shock you a little bit, but I'll explain it. Andy Coan was not my hero, at least not at first. He was not my hero for about the first 40 plus years that I knew him. Andy was Andy. My family moved to Fort Lauderdale in 1973. I was 15. We moved from Miami, and I joined the Jack Nelson swim team. And Andy, for some reason, became my friend, in spite of the fact that I had 3 handicaps. One is that I went to a different high school, so we didn't hang out together during the day. Second is that I was slow. So I was not in the same, really in the same practice with Andy. He was with the national team. I was with the, I don't think it was the Mud Skippers, but whatever they call it. I was a little bit above Mud Skippers. And the third and the biggest handicap in Andy's mind, I was a breaststroker. Or as Andy would say, a non-swimmer. You know, he said that to the West Boca swimmers when he came over. He said that about me. All those years I knew Andy, I never knew that he considered breaststrokers non-swimmers. So to his credit, he hid it from me because he was quite a gentleman. And Andy said something, he was quoted in the Miami Herald in 1988. He didn't realize how prophetic he was when he said this because he already had a lot to look back on. But he was quoted by saying, "No one can say they've gone higher, and no one can say they've fallen any lower." And when I read that quote, I was doing a little research to prepare for this. It reminded me of one of my favorite poems. There's a poem by Rudyard Kipling called "If." And Kipling goes on to say all these things that determine a man's character as to whether you're a true man. And one of the things he said was, if you can meet with triumph and disaster, then treat those 2 imposters just the same. Andy met with triumph, Andy met with disaster, but from my point of view, and I was privileged to see some of his highest highs, I was privileged to, he treated those 2 imposters just the same. And let me give you 3 examples. One of the highest highs that I saw, I was privileged to be at Lawrenceville in February of 1975 when he swam that 43.9. That was one of the highest highs I've seen. And where's Colin? Colin also saw that race. He was in the lane next to him. So I think he told me he came in 4th. So he's probably the only person in here who had that view of Andy. But that was one of Andy's highest highs. And Andy was the same person after he smashed the national record in the 100 freestyle that he was before that. And in fact, I was a little upset that he was the same person because it cost me some money. There were so many people lining up to get his autograph that I tried to run a scam with Andy where I would charge $5 and I'd get, people would cut in line, and Andy just laughed at me. He wouldn't go for that. So he was the same person after his highest high. Probably the lowest low that I witnessed, and you fast forward to 2014, I received a phone call from my brother saying, "Andy's in the hospital." And I said, "What's wrong?" He says, "I heard he's paralyzed." So I found out he was at University of Miami Hospital. I drove down there. I'd walk into his room. He wasn't in the room. So I went searching for him in the hospital, and I found him laying on a gurney, getting ready to be wheeled in for a procedure called plasmapheresis, I believe it was. Some of the doctors in here might correct me. But he, when he saw me and he looked at me, his face, the pain and the fear in his eyes was the lowest low that I've ever seen Andy. And the reason there was fear is that the paralysis was climbing up his body. It had gotten to here, and if it went any higher, it was going to stop his breathing. That was the lowest low I ever saw, but 2 days later, when he knew he was going to make it, he was back to being the same old Andy. He was the kind of guy that you'd walk into the hospital room and say, "How you doing?" Or you'd call him and say, "How you doing?" And this is another word, I'm sure you've heard this, he'd say, "Fantastic." Remember that? "How are you doing, champ?" I called him champ. I didn't call him horse because I wasn't in the lanes. I couldn't call him a horse, but I called him champ because I said, "Champs, get up off the ground and fight back," and that's what he did. My ringtone when Andy called was the Rocky theme song, and it would just get me pumped up whenever Andy would call, and I'd say, "How you doing, champ?" and he'd say, "Fantastic." He was the same person every single time. And I want to read another quote that I came up with in my research. Some of you might, and if you haven't seen this, I encourage you to go to YouTube and just put in Andy Coan. And there was, I think it was the 1980 NCAA Swim Championships. He was interviewed by the Wide World of Sports. Did anybody see that? And he said this, and I've written this down. I have to read it because it's a pretty long quote, but I think it really says who Andy was. They talked about, says, "What's going through your mind, Andy?" And this is what he said. He says, "I've had to compensate. Everything's a lot different. I just tried to block out what was before and live with what I've got now and not even think back." And then this is the best part. He said, "I'm pretty much the same old person, but living with new handicaps, I guess." That was in 1979. You fast forward to 2014, same old person, living with handicaps. And I talked about one of his highest highs. I talked about the lowest low that I know. But let me tell you what I think was the highest high of Andy's life. And it wasn't the world record. I wasn't here to see that, but it wasn't the world record. I'll tell you what the highest high was, and ironically enough, it happened at his mother's funeral. Because we brought Andy in to his mother's funeral, and Richard came up and took charge. Richard took his wheelchair, pushed him to the front, sat with him, you put your arm around him, and you made sure your dad was okay. That was the highest high of Andy's life. He was so proud of you. And not just because of that, he was proud of you all the time. All he ever talked about was Richard. So, Richard, he saw that day you becoming the man he wants you to be. He was so proud of you. He loved you so much. You were absolutely the center of his life. So that, to me, was the highest high that Andy saw. Now, you've heard how special Andy is, and you heard how he touched everybody's heart. I don't really have the words to say how Andy touched my heart, so I'm actually going to steal something that I saw. Some of you saw, I thought, the most touching tribute was at the NCAA Championships this year. The Tennessee swim team showed how Andy touched their heart. And in case you didn't see it, here it was, Andy Coan. So, let me tell you how Andy became my hero. And again, I'm going to borrow some words that somebody more eloquent than I did, or that I am, said. And this was one of the swimmers from West Boca High. The last week of Andy's life, 6 kids came in to visit him. To me, that was amazing. There's no way I could have done that when I was in high school. And they came in to see their coach, and they showed him their love and affection and admiration, and then they asked me, or Andy asked me, because he was getting a little tired, he sort of motioned with his eyes like, okay, get him out of here. Not in a mean sense, but he just needed to recover a little bit. And I took them into Andy's office, and I showed him Andy's scrapbook. They were not who Andy was, because he was so humble, he never said that. They saw him as a swim coach. And one of the kids there, and this is the words that I'm going to use, one of the kids there said to me, "He changed us." And that, to me, is a definition of a hero. Somebody who changes you, makes you better. Andy Coan made me a better man for having known him. That's why he was my hero. And I'm just going to close with words from one of my favorite philosophers, Mr. Jimmy Buffett. In his song, The Captain and the Kid, he said, he died about a month ago while winter filled the air. And though I cried, I was so proud to love a man so rare. Godspeed, my friend, until we meet again.